November 12th, 1976. The Bitter End, a small folk club in Greenwich Village. Bob Dylan was 3 songs into an unannounced set, and nobody in that cramped room could believe their luck. The Bitter End wasn't Madison Square Garden. It was a basement club with exposed brick walls, mismatched chairs, and a stage barely big enough for one person. Maybe 80 people packed into a space meant for 60, cigarette smoke hanging in the air like fog. The kind of place where legends were born before they became legends. Dylan stood center stage, acoustic guitar slung low, harmonica rack around his neck. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, his curly hair wild under the dim stage lights. No announcement, no warning. He just walked in an hour earlier and asked if he could play. The owner, a man named Paul Colby, nearly had a heart attack. Bob Dylan wanted to play his club. Tonight, right now. Word spread fast. By the time Dylan hit his second song, people were pressed against the walls, sitting on the floor, standing in the doorway. Nobody moved. Nobody talked. They just listened. Dylan's voice filled the small space, raspy and hypnotic. His fingers moved across the guitar strings with the kind of casual mastery that made it look effortless. Every word landed like it meant something. Every pause felt intentional. This was Dylan at his best. Intimate, raw, present. The third song was Tangled Up in Blue, and halfway through the second verse, Dylan's eyes were closed, lost in the music. The audience was breathing in sync with him, hanging on every word. Nobody noticed the door at the back of the room open. Nobody noticed the tall figure in black step inside and stand perfectly still. Nobody noticed anything except Bob Dylan, until the room went silent. It started with the people near the door. A woman turned her head, then froze. The man next to her followed her gaze and his mouth fell open. Then another person. Then another. Like dominoes, the realization spread through the room in a wave of silent shock. Johnny Cash was standing at the back of the Bitter End. He wasn't dressed for a night out. He was dressed like he always dressed, head to toe in black. Black shirt, black pants, black boots. His face weathered and serious, his eyes fixed on the stage. He didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge anyone. He just stood there with his arms crossed, watching Bob Dylan sing. The whispers started small. Is that? Oh my God, that's Johnny Cash. Dylan was mid-verse, eyes still closed, completely unaware. But the energy in the room had shifted. People were no longer looking at the stage. They were looking at the back of the room, then back at Dylan, then back at Cash. Someone near the front turned to get a better look at Cash, and their chair scraped against the floor. That's when Dylan opened his eyes. He didn't stop playing immediately, but his fingers faltered on the strings, just for a second. His voice dropped out mid-word, then came back weaker. Dylan's eyes scanned the room, trying to understand why 80 people were suddenly acting strange, why they were looking past him, why the air felt different. And then he saw him. Johnny Cash, standing at the back of the room, uninvited, unexpected, watching. Dylan's hands stopped moving. The guitar strings went silent, and for 5 impossible seconds, nobody in the Bitter End breathed. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes your ears ring. Dylan stood frozen on stage, his hands still on the guitar, staring at Johnny Cash like he was seeing a ghost. Cash didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with that unreadable expression, arms still crossed. Someone in the audience coughed. It sounded like an explosion. Dylan's mind was racing. Why was Johnny Cash here? They knew each other, of course. They'd crossed paths at festivals, recording studios, award shows. They respected each other. But this wasn't a planned visit. This wasn't a collaboration. This was Johnny Cash walking into his show unannounced. Dylan looked down at his guitar, then back up at Cash, then out at the audience, who were all collectively holding their breath. What do you do when one legend walks into another legend's show? What's the protocol? The etiquette? Dylan had performed for presidents, for millions of people, for hostile crowds who booed him off stage when he went electric. He'd faced criticism, backlash, worship, hatred. He'd seen everything. But he'd never had Johnny Cash show up unannounced in the middle of a song. The silence stretched longer. 10 seconds, 15. It felt like an hour. Paul Colby, the club owner, was standing near the bar, watching this unfold with his heart pounding. He'd seen a lot in his years running the bitter end. He'd seen fights, breakups, proposals, legendary performances, but he'd never seen anything like this. Two of the biggest names in American music, in his club at the same time, with 80 people watching in complete silence. Someone near the front whispered, "What's happening?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what these two men meant to each other. Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash weren't just musicians. They were revolutionaries. Different revolutions, but revolutions nonetheless. Dylan had taken folk music and turned it into poetry. He'd challenged the establishment, questioned authority, and changed what songs could say. He was the voice of a generation that didn't trust anyone over 30. Cash had taken country music and made it dangerous. He sang about prisoners, outlaws, and the forgotten. He was the man in black who stood up for people nobody else cared about. They'd first met in the early 1960s, back when Dylan was still the kid from Minnesota with a guitar and a dream. Cash had seen something in him, something real. In 1969, Cash had invited Dylan onto his television show. At a time when Dylan was being criticized, questioned, and dismissed by parts of the music industry, Cash gave him a platform, defended him, believed in him. Dylan never forgot that, but they'd gone their separate ways after that. Different tours, different albums, different lives. They'd see each other occasionally, exchange pleasantries, but they weren't close until tonight. November 12th, 1976. The bitter end. Two legends. One unexpected moment. Dylan stood on that stage remembering all of this in the space of those 15 seconds of silence. Remembering Cash's kindness, his support, his belief, and he made a decision. Dylan took his hands off the guitar, let it hang from the strap around his neck. He stepped up to the microphone and spoke for the first time since the music stopped. His voice was quiet, conversational, like he was talking to a friend in a bar. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dylan said, "we have a guest." The audience shifted. A few people exhaled. Someone laughed nervously. Dylan looked directly at Johnny Cash. "John, you planning to just stand there all night?" Cash's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe amusement. "Or are you going to come up here and help me finish this song?" The room erupted, not with screaming or cheering, but with gasps, with shocked laughter, with the sound of 80 people realizing they were about to witness something extraordinary. But Cash didn't move. He stood at the back of the room, still as a statue, his face unreadable. Dylan waited. The audience waited. The entire club held its breath again. 5 seconds passed, then 10, and then Johnny Cash smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small upward turn of his mouth. But it changed everything. Cash uncrossed his arms, took a step forward, then another. He moved slowly through the crowd, and people pressed themselves against the walls to let him pass. He walked like he always walked, confident, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. When he reached the stage, he looked up at Dylan. "You sure about this?" Dylan grinned. "When have I ever been sure about anything?" Cash laughed, a deep, warm sound that filled the room. He climbed the 2 steps onto the tiny stage. Two legends, 3 feet apart, on a stage barely big enough for one. The audience lost their minds. Dylan didn't say anything else. He just repositioned his guitar, looked at Cash, and started playing again. He picked up Tangled Up in Blue right where he'd left off. Same verse, same chord progression, like the interruption had never happened. But now Johnny Cash was standing next to him. Cash didn't have a guitar, didn't have an instrument. He just stood there, hands clasped in front of him, listening. Dylan sang the next verse alone. His voice carried through the small club, every word clear and deliberate. And then, as Dylan reached the chorus, Johnny Cash began to sing. His voice came in low and steady, harmonizing with Dylan's raspy tenor. The two voices shouldn't have worked together. Dylan's was wild and unpredictable. Cash's was deep and controlled, but they blended perfectly. The audience forgot to breathe again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from beauty. Two of the greatest voices in American music, improvising a harmony that had never been rehearsed, creating something in real time that could never be replicated. Dylan glanced at Cash, still playing guitar. Cash glanced back, still singing, and for a moment, a smile passed between them. Not a performance smile, a real one. This wasn't about the audience anymore. This was two old friends remembering why they loved music in the first place. Dylan's fingers moved across the strings, and Cash's voice followed, weaving in and out of the melody, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes countering, always complementing. The song built to its final verse, and they sang it together. Two voices, one song, 80 people witnessing something they'd tell their grandchildren about. When the last chord faded, the silence returned. But this time it was different. This time it was reverent. And then the room exploded with applause. The applause thundered through the bitter end for nearly a minute. People were on their feet, shouting, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Dylan stood at the microphone, still holding his guitar, looking slightly overwhelmed. Cash stood beside him, that small smile still on his face. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. When the applause finally died down, Dylan spoke into the microphone. "John, you want to stick around for a few more?" Cash looked at him. "I came to listen, not to perform." "Then pull up a chair." Someone in the front row immediately stood and offered their seat. Cash nodded his thanks, took the chair, and positioned it to the side of the stage. He sat down, leaned back, and crossed his arms again. Back to watching. Dylan launched into his next song, Simple Twist of Fate, a slower, more melancholic piece. He sang it directly to Cash, like he was having a conversation. Cash listened with his eyes closed. Every now and then, his head would nod slightly in time with the music. The audience watched both men, Dylan singing, Cash listening, two artists showing respect the only way they knew how, through silence and music. 3 more songs followed. Dylan played them all, and Cash sat perfectly still, absorbing every word. Nobody left. Nobody checked their watch. Nobody looked away. This was church, and these were the hymns. After the 6th song, Dylan set his guitar down and walked over to Cash. They spoke in low voices that the audience couldn't hear. Cash nodded, stood up, shook Dylan's hand, a firm, long handshake that said more than words could. Then he walked off the stage, back through the crowd and toward the door. People tried to say something to him, to thank him, to tell him what this meant. But Cash just nodded politely and kept moving. At the door, he turned back one last time, made eye contact with Dylan across the room. Dylan raised his hand in a small wave. Cash returned it, and then he was gone. The audience sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then they turned back to Dylan, who was picking up his guitar again. "Well," Dylan said into the microphone, his voice dry with amusement, "that was unexpected." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Dylan played 3 more songs to close out the set. But everyone knew. The show was already over. The real moment had already happened. When Dylan finally finished and walked off stage, Paul Colby grabbed him immediately. "Do you have any idea what just happened?" Paul's voice was shaking. Dylan shrugged. "Johnny Cash walked into my show." "Dylan, that's going to be talked about for decades." Dylan looked at him with those tired, knowing eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just 2 musicians sharing some songs." But Paul was right, and Dylan knew it. By the next morning, word had spread through Greenwich Village like wildfire. By the afternoon, it had reached every music journalist in New York. By the end of the week, it was in Rolling Stone. Dylan and Cash's secret show, the Night 2 Legends, shared a stage nobody knew about. The 80 people who'd been in the bitter end that night became instant celebrities in music circles. Everyone wanted to know what it was really like, what was said, what wasn't said. Some people embellished, added details that didn't happen, claimed Dylan and Cash had played 5 songs together instead of 1. But most people told the truth. And the truth was powerful enough. 2 weeks after the show, a journalist tracked down Johnny Cash and asked him about it. "Why did you go to Dylan's show? Why that night?" Cash's answer was simple. "I was in New York. I heard Dylan was playing. I wanted to hear him, so I went." "Did you know you'd end up on stage?" Cash smiled. "Bob Dylan doesn't do what you expect. That's why he's Bob Dylan." "What did you talk about after the show?" "That's between me and him." The journalist tried to push further, but Cash shut it down. Some moments were meant to stay private. Dylan, when asked about it months later, was equally cryptic. "Johnny Cash walked into a room. I was playing a song. He stayed. That's all." But the smile on his face when he said it told a different story. The Bitter End show became legendary, not because it was recorded, not because it was planned, but because it was real. In an industry full of manufactured moments, prepackaged collaborations, and calculated publicity stunts, this was something genuine. Two artists who respected each other. Two legends who didn't need a stage or a camera to prove anything. Years later, music historians would point to that night as an example of what made the 1970s folk scene special. The intimacy, the spontaneity, the willingness to just show up and make music because music mattered. The Bitter End is still there today, on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. And if you ask Paul Colby about his favorite night in 40 years of running that club, he'll tell you about November 12th, 1976. He'll tell you about Bob Dylan playing to 80 people, about Johnny Cash walking through the door, about the room going silent, about two legends sharing a song that nobody expected. He'll tell you that sometimes the best moments in music aren't the ones that fill stadiums or top the charts. Sometimes they're the ones that happen in a cramped basement club where 80 people got lucky enough to witness history. Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash both passed away. Cash in 2003, Dylan still performing in his 80s. But that night lives on, in the stories, in the memories, in the reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when nobody's watching, except for 80 people in a basement club in Greenwich Village, who saw two legends, one unexpected moment, and a silence that said everything.